to the Magoffin Home. This is one of our regular Brain Trust lectures, and this is the beginning of a series of lectures that we hope to bring to you on occasion about the servants, workers, and the people who supported the Magoffin family. As many of us in the room are staff and volunteers and board members and supporters of the Magoffin Home, we know that that family, through 4 generations here in El Paso, accomplished a great number of things. From politics to church, their personal lives, they were incredibly accomplished. And part of the way that they were able to be so accomplished and to spend so much time focusing on their community was because they were supported by people who worked for them, worked with them, worked under them, people who were servants, people who were workers. And so we are interested in those individuals. We've been studying them and have a spreadsheet of over 82 different named individuals who worked here for 4 generations. This talk is going to be a little different than the other talks because we're going to focus on one person in particular. And before we really dig down into that research, I'd like to start with a thank you, because research is a community experience. And so we've been reaching out to members of our community like the Isleta del Sur tribe, like the San Elizario Genealogical Historical Society, like Concordia Heritage Association, EPCC, our own colleagues with the Historical Commission. And so the research that I'm showing today is a result of conversations with all of these individuals across many months and years of research. We're going to be focusing today on a man named Jose Sierra. If you've been on a tour here, you might have heard him mentioned. My goal today was to include everything, soup and nuts and the kitchen sink, all the things that we know and that we don't know, and talk to you a little bit about how we know them. So strangely, we're going to start with Jose's death certificate. This was a wonderful piece of data that was recently discovered by Joseph Longo. And like any death certificate, it includes a lot of basic and useful information, which gives us tools we can use to research in other places. One of the things I always like to pay attention to with historical documents is who's writing the document and why, who's providing the information, and do I know that they know what they're talking about? Because I think we've all been in a situation of being asked a question and inventing an answer. This is a section from right down here. And so we see that this death certificate was completed on information from Mrs. James Magoffin, who is Anne Buford Magoffin, the sister or the daughter-in-law of the Magoffin family. So not somebody who grew up with Jose, maybe not somebody who knew him very well. Maybe we should be questioning this data. From the year of his death, 1921, we can approximate his year of birth. And I use that information to keep looking for him. We're going to be looking at a couple of different census records. How familiar is this room with the way that census records works? Raise your hand if you feel very confident in census records. All right, I got 2 hands, 3 and a half. I'll be talking a little bit about how census records works then. So the government loves to know where we are and how much money we earn. It's the way that they can tax us. At its base, census records are a way for the government to help administer society. So every 10 years, the United States government and many other governments across the world, some on different schedules, do a census where they try and record everybody in the area. This is the 1860 census from San Elizario, spelled E-L-C-E-A-R-E-O. And here is a specific portion, 2 lines of that census, that show a 10-year-old boy named Jose Sierra living with a woman who seems to be unrelated to him. I see that he has a profession listed here as herder, perhaps. A little bit hard to read that word. So if anybody else has a different interpretation, I would love to hear it. However, I don't know if this is our Jose Sierra. So we had a chance to go down to San Elizario to talk to them about their census records, and it is quite a common name. So there are a number of different Jose Sierras who lived in that community at this time period. This is the only one that kind of matches age-wise, and after this individual falls off the map. I cannot find any evidence of this particular Jose or the woman that he lived with. I don't know if this was our Jose. Let's keep looking in the records. The 1870 and the 1880 censuses for the Magoffin family don't include Jose. I'm not sure if he was with them then or not. The 1890 census for the United States was almost entirely destroyed in a fire. So almost nobody has records from that year. We're still looking. Let's see what we did find. This is the El Paso 1900 census. And right here in the middle is the home in which we are all seated, I'm standing, the Magoffin home and the family that lived in it. Let's zoom in. So the census is organized by location and then by name. Oftentimes it's organized in order of societal importance. So you start with the head of the family, the person who earns the most, Joseph Magoffin right here. You have the year of his birth, you have information about his color and his sex, information about the number of years he was married. We can do a little bit of math to discover a lot of info on people if it's filled out. So you see him, his wife, his children, the family friends, the Newmans, and 3 servants. We have Maria Torres, Gertrude Arabia, and Jose Sierra. All 3 are listed as servants. When you see the word D-O, it often means same as above. It's the same as that sort of quotation symbol. So Gertruda is a servant, as is Jose. Let's do a little bit more zooming in. We can see that Jose is listed as a white person, a male, born in November of 1860, and that he is single, unmarried. All right, that's some data. Here's the second half of that document. So up here, for Joseph Magoffin, you can see his place of birth is Mexico. His father's place of birth was Kentucky. His mother's place of birth was Mexico. He's the mayor. He can read, he can write, he can spell in English. He owns his home. He is a free owner of his home. The bank doesn't own it, it's not mortgaged. And he works from home. Anybody else? Let's look at Jose. He was born in Texas. His parents were both born in Mexico. His profession is listed as coachman. He was not employed, or he was unemployed for zero months last year. He can read and write and speak English. All right, information. Let's keep going. This is the 1920 census. 1910, I do not have a record. 1920, we see a lot of information that backs up what we just saw. So nothing that really argues against this. Here we have verification that his parents were born in Mexico and spoke Spanish, that Jose himself also spoke Spanish. His profession here is listed as a servant working in a house and earning a wage, W for wage, as opposed to an unwaged earner. Any questions at this point? Right now it's a little bit dry, but we're about to get more interesting. Let's put this on pause. Yes,
so
sir.
remind me that the previous census, did it mention about the wage earner?
It did not.
Okay.
It did not. And you picked up on a thread. This is the only instance I can find of proof that Jose was paid a wage. Let's look again at his death. It's really annoying that when we die, that really seems to be the moment where the most information gets written down about us. But when Mr. Jose passed away in July of 1921, 2 different El Paso newspapers picked up the story, the El Paso Times and the El Paso Herald. The Times ran this article, which I believe that you are all reading at this moment. Highlights from that article include that he was, quote, an Indian with a brother in Isleta. From that, we interpret that perhaps he came from Isleta, although I do have that census from San Elizario, which makes it complicated. He'd been with the Magoffin family since he was a child. He'd worked for over 50 years, which means that he started working at the Magoffin home at least as early as 1871, and he was an unmarried person. Interestingly, this little obituary, which doesn't seem like a lot for a summary of a whole life, was actually picked up in national news coverage. So we see Jose Sierra's name in the Rapid City, South Dakota Journal. We see it in the North Platte Evening Telegraph. And you can see the way that they copied a lot of the same language from the El Paso Times, but they also left a couple of words out. This was really common in that time period, where newspapers would subscribe to all kinds of other newspapers from across the nation and the world, and then copy articles out of it, sometimes making small alterations, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes doing it perfectly. This also popped up in Prescott, Arizona, where the name of the article was changed to The Ideal Servant. At this time period, there were also a lot of social changes where the ways that people interacted with their servants was changing. So there's a little bit of subtext here where they're talking about sort of the old-fashioned ideals. The El Paso Paso Herald had a more full more full article for Jose when he passed away. So from this article, we gain verification of the facts we've already discovered, but we also have a few more details. He still has a brother in Isleta. His brother's name is Jose, and he works manufacturing and selling Indian blankets. We get a description of Jose as a short man, less than 5 feet tall. So I'm sorry, Frank, I'm not sure you can play Jose again for Death at Magoffin, he might be too tall. And he's estimated to be 65 or 70 years old. And from that article, if we do the math, that means that he came to live with Joseph Magoffin when he was between 5 and 10 years old. Any questions? I saw a twitch. All right. Let's keep going. This article was also picked up nationally in Wichita Falls, in Pennsylvania, and in the lovely town of Cleburne, Texas. Let's go back to the death certificate. There's a little bit of information we didn't cover in that, including his cause of death. So it's listed as Bright's disease. I know I have a nurse in the room. Bright's disease is not a term that we use so much these days. It's an old-fashioned term for a kidney malfunction. Oftentimes it's associated with alcoholism, although not necessarily. But it does not seem like a very pleasant way to go. Also from the death certificate, we have a couple of details about what the very last moments that Jose spent above the ground were like. So we know that he was picked up by Pete Hagedorn Undertaking Company, which was a popular undertaker here in El Paso, more for the working men. We know that the pastor who oversaw his final mass was Reverend Michael Cronin, who was the Reverend at Immaculate Conception Church. So I believe that was probably set up by the Magoffin family to help have him have a final mass. And we also know that he was interred at Concordia Cemetery. So here's an image of a building that existed at Concordia during Jose's life. So for us, this isn't something that we see today. It was the church that existed there that has since passed. But when he spent time there and when he was interred, this would have been part of the vision.
Where the heck was that building on the Concordia property?
Please.
It's under I-10.
Alas. But Jose is not. So, hey, Ben Dowell is underneath the street. There are plenty of great El Pasoans who are underneath the streets. So let's look at where Jose is in Concordia, because as we all drive by and go home today, we can say a wave. So here is a map that gives us the approximate location. A little bit hard to tell from a map, so let's look at a screenshot. So this is the beautiful green section of the cemetery, the 2 Jewish cemeteries, Mount Sinai and B'nai Zion. And up here, right at the corner, in the Catholic pauper section here, we have Jose Sierra. And if I advance us one slide, around where this backpack is set is where Jose is buried. In our research, and this research was provided by the Concordia Heritage Association, that board also voted to give us funds to give Jose Sierra a headstone. So they've appropriated $700 so that we can honor him appropriately. And that's something that we plan to move forward with in the next year or two. Finishing this research and learning more about his life, we hope will give us more tools to be able to honor him at that moment. So, those are a lot of the documents I have about Jose, which really doesn't paint a picture of whole life, does it? So let's try and add in some details. Let's try and add a little bit of flesh to these bones. You've been really nice looking at these historical documents. So I'd like to give you some beautiful images and a little bit of a palate cleanser. What might have Jose have seen in his life? What was his interactions with this place like? We're operating off the assumption that he comes from Isleta or one of those 3 missions. The Isleta is the closest mission to us, followed by Socorro and San Elizario. As a member of the Isleta tribe, born in 1851, we believe, and having lived there, he would have known people who had traveled, who had memories of older revolts. He would have been sort of a man between 2 worlds, who would have had things from his native ancestors and from his community but also been a participant in El Paso and the other communities. This is a lovely image of the Isleta del Sur Pueblo that was drawn by a Confederate soldier in 1862. And so if Jose was 10 when he came to work for the Magoffins, I believe that this is what he would have left behind to come and visit and work with us here, and what he might have visited when he went home. We have some photo documentation of the Isleta del Sur tribe and Isleta during that time period as well. For example, one of the few historic photographs is this image of Nestor Granillo. And interestingly, the Granillo family also worked for the Magoffins in Magoffinsville. We hope to study them later. But she was a potter who made this pot and is standing in front of an old oven or horno that was used to bake bread. But that is at the Isleta del Sur Pueblo. And here is another image also of her walking away, a little bit of a bigger drawback. But this isn't really the Isleta that we know and think of today. Of note, there are still a few pieces of real historical items from that time period that were produced. So here is a pot that was made by a Tigua potter in 1894. The Tiguas at that time were people who were very religious, who studied the Catholic faith, but also were inspired by their ancestral beliefs. So at festivals like the Festival of San Antonio, you would see very Catholic elements, but you would also see more native elements brought in attire, in clothing, in the way that people would have danced or spoken. The church itself looked very different than it did today. I love this image with the beautiful adobe bell tower that no longer exists. Yeah, that was Jose's reality. This photo is just slightly out of order, I apologize. But this is an image from 1912 of a religious ceremony that involved masked ancestors with contemporary Christian elements as well. And also a look at some of the people. So these are 4 different Tigua people who served as U.S. Army Scouts. And so they had their photos made as part of their service in the U.S. Army. But between the 1840s and the 1880s, many of the Tigua men and most of the people who considered themselves warriors served in the U.S. Army. They enlisted at San Elizario, and they served on the frontier here, at Fort Bliss, at Fort Davis, at Fort Quitman, and all along, including through the Civil War. So as Jose was growing up, the people around him, the people that he looked up and was respected to, would have been these men. Here's another image of Isleta, colorized, a bit of a blurry image, and so here is a secondary image that was not colorized, that's a little bit more clear to see and to view. I love the adobe bricks on the side, very similar to what we've got going in the back here of the Magoffin home. And in looking at one of my questions in researching the Isleta del Sur is about that Tigua blanket making tradition. In Jose's obituary, it talks about his brother making blankets. And so we find some references to that in history, but that is a skill that has since passed out of knowledge. In speaking with contemporary members, such as these young people who are part of the current dance community that displays their culture, they talked about how that's not something that's known now, and they have to purchase blankets and woven goods from other native people. So I wonder if Jose's brother Jesus, was making blankets, or if this was something that the newspapers got wrong. Hard to tell. A few more group shots, and let's move on to a few more specifics. What did he do here? Jose spent his entire life living and working in the Magoffin home, and what was that like? What were his jobs? What was his purpose? We've got a lot of different answers. So we know that he worked with horses, coaches, and in the stables. You've seen already that he was listed as a coachman, and from his obituary, it talks about how he worked as a stable boy as a child. Here are some images of horses here at the Magoffin home, saddles and tack that he would have had interactions with. It's a little bit of a light connection, but behind every photo like this, you have to imagine Jose bringing the horse out and feeding it, and combing it and putting the things on and unsaddling it, helping the children on, perhaps even teaching them how to ride the horses. We also know that as the city was developed, Jose's skills changed from that as a pure horse taker care of, great English there, woohoo, to that as a handyman and a coach driver. We have some lovely oral histories from the children who grew up in this home, including Colonel Joseph Magoffin Glasgow. And so he talks about his grandfather, Joseph Magoffin, as the bank vice president, and how Jose used to take him to the bank and carry and drive. And I love this part here where he talks about, especially at the bottom, how hard it was. He says, the trouble I had turning the corner of the State National Bank on Oregon Street because of the streetcar tracks. The rims of the carriage wheels would get stuck in the streetcar track and nearly cause accidents. You had to be sure to get as much of a right angle as you could so that the wheels wouldn't get stuck. It wasn't necessarily an easy job. It would have taken skill, it would have taken expertise, and it wasn't something that Mr. Magoffin did for himself commonly. And in fact, if you look at this image, which was taken on that street we all just walked across, facing the home, you can see the fence behind us. We have Joseph and Octavia with their mule ready to go down the street. But if you're a horse person looking at this, do you notice anything about the way that the horse is tied to the equipment? It's okay, Barbara Angus isn't in the room. She's the woman who gave me this information. You see his ears are really tight back. This is a mule who's a little bit uncomfortable. And you see this string here, that is extremely tight. This is a mule who's really been made to be in position. I interpret this as Jose not necessarily trusting his employer to drive his own horse. I'm gonna set it up so that all of the hazards are on, the bumper rails are available on the bowling lane. This is the best setup I could do because I'm not gonna be the coach driver that day. Maybe I'm extrapolating, but you can see evidence of Jose in these moments and in these photos. The city directories have been a really lovely resource for us in researching Joseph Magoffin, in researching his son Jim, and how they operated through society. They're changing jobs, they're changing addresses, and you can see the same thing here with Jose Sierra. So I've gone through every city directory in El Paso history, only been able to find Jose in these specific years, and they're pretty consistent. He's a yard man pretty regularly, he's a servant a little bit, and a yard man very regularly. One of the notes here is that he's always living on site. A lot of the other Magoffin staff sometimes lived on site, sometimes had houses elsewhere, just like myself, came in, checked in the morning, went home for dinner. But Jose lived here on site. The yard that he maintained, yes ma'am.
I just had a question.
Yes.
So that prior one in 1903, it shows 708 Magoffin, is that before the address change?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So I believe that the streets changed right around like 1906. And so this used to be 708 Magoffin, and then by 1908, we're 1120 Magoffin. So it's actually the same residence. Nice catch. And he's got R, which generally means resides. When Jose was maintaining this house, it was a much larger space than it was today. The home itself was the same square footage, but the land was vast, acres upon acres. There were orchards, there were herds of sheep, there were donkeys and mules and the occasional horse. There were all kinds of things for him to take care of. So as we look and we see all of the beautiful trees planted along the roadway, as we see the things that are planted, as we look at the house and the plastering, we think of Jose. And as we look at more details, the family talks often about the rose arches and the irises that were planted, about the cottonwoods that stood and the Italian cypresses that got planted as well. It wasn't Joseph Magoffin digging the holes, it probably wasn't Jim. Here's a few more images of some of the areas that we know were well taken care of, that we know were really loved by the family and the community. And a little bit more. That's a big yard. I'm often intimidated by the size of what we have to take care of. And we have all of our modern equipment, we have all of our modern tools. He was also a bit of a cowboy. So Mary Magoffin Carter is one of the children that spent time here and has memories of Jose, and she left behind a very extensive oral history. And so she has very specific memories. She talks about the cows, about how they would put them in the icebox in the family parlor, which might be a nice moment to mention on our tours, about how they would eat the cream and how delightful it was. And also about exchanging the cows with a ranch in Isleta, about how Jose would take the cows there to rest, to recover, perhaps bring back cows who were in milk and had calves, and trading back and forth. Also his care of the pigeon pens, which is something we forget, is they had a big pigeon coop out back, and the pigeons were a normal part of dinner, just like chicken was. And so caring, killing, cleaning, all would have been part of that. If you look at the 1880 census, the Magoffin home is specified as a farm that year. And so they go through and they really list out all the things that we had. And we know that this was a year where Jose was working, where he was a big part. So he had 200 acres of orchards and vineyards, 100 acres of forest, 50 acres of old fields, 100 acres of tilled lands, and about $300 worth of goods, and 4 horses. Jose was also, much like our own maintenance supervisor today, a one-man HVAC unit. He made this place comfortable on the inside and the outside. So they were constantly, and there are many stories of them bringing and hauling wood, bringing it back and forth, chopping it, making it smaller, putting it in the fireboxes, cleaning out the fireboxes, cleaning the chimneys, going up on the roof, making sure the chimney wasn't stuffed by a bird nest. All of those different things that were associated with it. Because he was always hauling wood and things from outside, inside, he also brought with it exciting creepy crawlies. So 2 of the different kids who grew up in this home mentioned Jose and scorpions. One has a really elaborate story about being a child and having Jose bring in a scorpion and sticking it in a jar, and then dumping the scorpion into the stove and letting it die. And that being something that he remembers very vividly. Here we have an interesting tidbit in the oral history. Mary Magoffin Carter is talking about how they kept the house warm. And she says it was all wood logs. Grandpa, Joseph Magoffin, would stop and buy the whole cord of wood for $5, and they'd chop it up, Jose and Jesus, we believe his brother. It's interesting she mentions they purchased the wood, but doesn't talk about paying the workers. And here's a nice quote. He really did the job of a Trojan, bringing in wood, chopping wood, keeping the fireplaces going. For those of us who interpret the home, as we are here giving tours, every fireplace is an opportunity to talk a little bit about Jose's work, about the ways that he contributed. We're talking a lot about keeping warm. What about keeping dry? Next week we're expecting some rain. And in the days of the Magoffins, so this room would have originally had that beautiful canvas covering it. When it rained, it leaked. And so water would collect on the canvas, and the canvas would drip down like a big balloon. And so Jose Sierra had a stick with a point on the end and stab the balloon, and it would drip out the water into a bucket or a big tub, and he would have to collect it. It's a little bit more janky than we like to think of our parlor being, but that would have been the reality. So I would like to suggest to us that we should get some tubs for the next time it rains and set those out. So we've seen areas where he moved through the home. We know that he was in the front yard, the backyard, the courtyard, all of the different rooms, but where was his space? Where did he stay? What was his home here? The back of the house. Typically speaking, and this is very natural or very standard, perhaps not natural, but standard for many of the homes at this time period, where the people who paid for the home would have been up front and the people who worked would have been closer to the back, which there's a little bit of efficiency. You know, that's where all the supplies were, that's where the pigeon coop was. So at the back of our home, on the other side of the courtyard, there's an area we call the carriage room. We believe that that's the area he spent most of his time. there are some fun stories about that. In particular, one told by Miss Mary Magoffin Carter. So when she was here, she was an elementary student. She was going to San Jacinto Plaza, or San Jacinto School, right around the corner. And one day, while she was at school, she and her siblings were brought home early by the police. And they were asked to stay inside. Because what had happened is that Jose was found at the back of the house unconscious. And Joseph Magoffin called for Dr. Pike to come and visit. And Dr. Pike assessed Jose and pronounced him dead from rabies. And the solution was to kill all the cats in the backyard. Then, as with today, there was a cat colony. And so Mary recalls standing in the back of the home, listening to the sounds of her grandfather and the doctor and the policeman trying to catch and kill the cats. In this commotion of guns going off, and I imagine people yelling at each other, no, there, that way, this, no, you got it. Jose woke up. He wasn't dead. A bit of a resurrection, exactly. He was, and if you remember his cause of death, Bright's disease, often associated with alcoholism. At that moment, he had a little bit of foam around his mouth. Probably he was passed out, but he was not dead. So the story is that for many years thereafter, Dr. Pike, and you will notice on his headstone it does not say doctor. He did not practice doctoring long after this, as far as I can tell from the evidence. But Mayor Magoffin would make fun of him for it. You know, are you sure he's dead, Dr. Pike? And with a setup like that, I mean, how couldn't you? We also have a little bit of evidence of Jose during the holidays. So this is a photo taken after Jose's life. We see the Admiral probably in the 1950s or 60s carving a turkey at Thanksgiving. But before that, we know that he would have hung the turkeys up on the trees, that he would climb up the ladder to let them get a little bit more gamey and exciting. And that he would also wrap up the oleanders when it was really cold to try and keep the plantings going. Any questions right now about Jose or his work or what we've covered? What other questions do you have going forward? Maybe things we haven't covered.
I want to talk about his small stature.
Mm-hmm.
And, okay, we don't quite know how he came to live here. And then he had all this 50 years of doing everything and being very useful and very involved and very central to the functioning. And then this tiny little guy is buried somewhere in Concordia, and we know exactly where he's buried?
Yes. Yes.
What's the process to actually get a headstone for identification?
So the process of creating the headstone or of finding the grave?
Just tell me the process of getting the headstone, please.
So what we'll do is we'll work with the Concordia Heritage Association. This presentation is part of that process. They were ready to go much earlier than I was, and I asked for a moment to do research so that we can learn more about Jose. I was hoping that we could make a very firm connection with some of his native ancestry so that when we build a headstone for him, it could honor that more appropriately. I think we'll probably end up with his dates of birth and his dates of death and his name. It might be as simple as that. But this will be a process as we go forward, talking with the Concordia Heritage Association and our own Casa Magoffin compañeros, who've agreed to pay for some of the difference. So yeah, we'll be in touch and we'll let you know as we have that scheduled. There will be a headstone laying, and I'm sure that there will be a public presentation to honor Jose and the cemetery and everybody else who's there.
Any known photographs of Jose?
Yes, let's get towards that. Something I expected y'all to ask was about the relationship between employer and employee. And it's complicated, even at this institution. There are many of us who work here, and we all have different relationships. So I'm gonna say that the relationship that one person had with Jose wouldn't be identical to others. We know that Joseph and Jose were very close. It almost seems a little bit like a Mutt and Jeff kind of situation where they were together, they were fond of each other, they supported each other. But Joseph's wife, Octavia, wasn't quite as fond of Jose. We see in a letter here from Joseph and his daughter, where he's talking about some of the family members, some of the other servants, and specifically, he says, "Old Jose is with us and as faithful as ever." It's an interesting term. That was in his obituary, wasn't it? Your mother, Octavia, and he have had a spat now and then, but he's been with us so long, we overlook a good many things. We also see reference to the family's relationships with their servants in Joseph Glasgow's oral history. So he's sort of talking generally about the people who worked with him, or worked for the family. And so he talks about a cook, a maid, and a handyman. I see a misspelling there, we'll fix that. That they primarily spoke Spanish, that his parents and grandparents also spoke Spanish, and that everybody was really congenial, that it was a bit of that family atmosphere in his memory. A question that we've come upon was Jose paid or unpaid? And I can tell you that we don't know for sure. I think that this was probably something that changed. And so the information I'm going to present now is more sort of general state of the world at that time, so that you are better able to make that decision yourselves, what you think the truth was. So, we're just going to spend a brief moment talking about local slavery issues. The land on which we're standing was once under the control of New Spain, which did have a sort of traditional slavery system based off the Middle Ages, where you have people who work land and you have people who are lords, patrons, who are in charge of the land. There were a lot of different laws that tried to change this over time. In 1517, there were efforts to stop enslavement of Africans, but it focused more on Native Americans as a result. In 1826, the very first African president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, ends slavery officially. And that's a big moment. But as with the United States, when you end something, it doesn't come to a screeching halt immediately. And so things did continue. Mexico, during the American Revolution and during the time period between the 1820s through the 1860s, was a place where the Underground Railroad fed into. People escaped slavery by going into Mexico. And yet, despite the fact that it was an area of liberation, it was also an area where peons existed and flourished, as did many in the American Southwest. A peon is a debt slave, somebody who's been enslaved via the debt of themselves or their ancestors. So if my parents had incurred a debt, I could be a peon underneath them. If my grandparents had created debt and my parents inherited it, I could inherit that as well. It often was the price paid for some religious rites, such as baptism or marriage, and it could be sold to others. So if I had someone who was indebted to me, I could sell that debt to somebody else. Similar things through history, through American history, might be sharecropping in the Jim Crow South, or if you think about mining towns where people were employed and only able to spend the money they were given by their employer at their employer's stores. Early El Paso communities had peons who worked on those properties and were indebted in those properties. Hart's Mill, Magoffinsville, Coons Rancho, Concordia were all institutions that worked with this type of system. And there's a really well-documented case in 1858 where American soldiers saw this system happening and sent reports to the American system saying, this is pretty messed up. And that person was never actually liberated. Here's a quote from Owen White, who was a historian of El Paso in the 1920s, looking back. And he's talking about sort of the Magoffinsville time period. And the subtext here is he's talking about Mexican laborers working hard in this area, the peons and the patrons, oftentimes the American landowners overseeing. A lot of the people who ended up in peonage positions were also in that position because of the interactions of Americans, of natives, and of Mexican people. So in North America, there is a huge history of native enslavement. So this is a graph from the book, The Other Kind of Slavery, which focuses on Native American enslavement over time. And I've highlighted here the years in which Jose Sierra was born. So over time, you can tell that this is a lull in that practice, and indeed, the end of that practice, but it was still going on. And so people like the Comanche or the Apache who lived in this part of the world would travel greatly and would oftentimes kidnap people on raids. Those individuals would sometimes be incorporated into the society, would be raised as a full member, but sometimes they would not be. Sometimes they would be sold to others as peons, and perhaps that's part of how Jose came here. Here's a different way to incorporate that data here. So this is the history of the total number of enslaved natives in North America. The green is for Mexican and Central American persons. The red is for the United States and Canada. The darker the color is the high estimate. The lower color is the low estimate. So probably the real number is somewhere between those two lines. Peonage was abolished by the United States via an act of the Supreme Court in 1867. But as we watch New Mexico and the world after that, you can see in 1868, the New Mexican, which is the newspaper in Santa Fe, says these laws have been indifferently applied. This is a gentleman named William Griffin who made it his life's mission to destroy that system. And he was moderately successful. He brought more than 300 different people to freedom, but was unable to persecute any of their enslavers through the law. So peonage really finished with people leaving peonage, but not necessarily in a grand way, not in a great moment, sort of a whimper of a conclusion. Which leads us to 1920, to this census we've already looked at, where we see that Jose has a wage. And there's three different ways you could be categorized that year. You could be O for your own account, you got your own bank account. Nobody pays you, you pay them. W for a wage, you earn a wage, or EM for employer. Joseph is an O. We also see in a little bit of the history some of the other people who worked there. We have a maid who worked for $8 a month. That very next sentence, we mention Jose. We do not mention what he earned. I don't know. What do y'all think based on this evidence? Perhaps a history of changing circumstance. And then the best question of all, what did Jose look like? We might know. So this is a photograph that was recently donated to the Magoffin home by the Lucker family. In the photos, we see the Glasgow children, Octavia, Harriet, and the boys. I'm not going to label them. This woman here, we've been able to identify through other photos as Dora Hernandez. Here she is here. This is a photo that was taken in Fort Myer, Virginia, on the day before Dora left to go home to Mexico to visit her family, and we believe did not come back again. So we know that she's in that photo. We know that this is around 1910, because that's when she was working. He's not much taller than any of these ladies, perhaps 5 feet, I'm not sure. And then for reference, here is an image of some of the other Tigua people that we know lived there at that time period. Is this Jose? Perhaps. I'm not sure. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to let you know that this is a work in process. So if there's anything I've said that doesn't jive with the history that you know, please come to me and let me know. And if you are somebody who is good at researching, if you're somebody who's a genealogist, I have 81 other people, including Dora, that I would like to know more about, and I could use your help. So please come and be a volunteer with us. And also, pay attention to some of the other things that we are doing here. So next month, we are going to be having another brain trust. We're going to be talking about opium, the Old West, and El Paso. There's Mr. Chessie here in the room. This is going to be an awesome talk, not only because it's going to talk about a drug we don't know a lot about, but because it connects the archaeology of the Magoffin home itself. When we last looked under the floors, we did find a little tiny opium bottle. We also have, anybody who has children in their life, we have an Adobe camp this weekend. this Friday, will be focused on children ages 10 to 12. They will get muddy, they will get dirty, they will learn something. Thank you all.